Hi guys, it's Sophie. So it's January 1st, it's that time again. I'm going to talk to you about my favourite books of 2021. So I've split them into fiction and non-fiction, and the way I did this, if you haven't watched one of these before, is at the end of every year I do a weird thing, which is I average out as far as I can all of my books that I've given star ratings to try and get the average as close to 3 stars as I can. So whilst it might not reflect how I felt about the books at the time, it means the 5-star books from every year are the absolute peak of the creme de la creme of everything I've read that year, and they're often the ones I reread or I recommend to people or that stay on my shelves long term. So this year I was really harsh and I tried to get as many books down to try and make it as even as I could. It ended up at 3.2, that was as low as I could get it. And the books that I'm going to share today are those that I couldn't give less than 5 stars. Like if I'd given one of them less than 5 stars, all of them would have lost it. And that's kind of like how I do my counts, is do all these books feel like they're about the same. So these are my absolute favourites. I've got about 10 of fiction and non-fiction. So we're going to start with fiction. So the first fiction I have is At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop. Lots of people have read this one. It's a really short one, about 150 pages, and this follows 2 Senegalese soldiers who are fighting in World War One. One of the 2 very close friends dies in the war, and we follow this like odd, mad, violent journey of these soldiers. It is so well written and so striking and very different that I couldn't not have this one on my best books of the year. Then I have Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. I read this one quite early on in 2021 and it stuck with me. It's a book I want to recommend to everyone, but I can't because they might think I've got something wrong with me. This is a strange book. It's marvellous. I want more from her like now. About this woman who is a photographer. So she takes, I would call them quite exploitative pictures of men, puts men in quite vulnerable, sexualised, violent positions, and we kind of see how far that will go. I just think it's brilliant. I loved it. I loved the setting as well, that it felt very, very real, very as if you could know this woman. I just think it was fabulous. I'm very excited to read more from her the minute she puts anything out. The next one we have is probably one of my favourite books of the whole year. I did gift this one this year to my stepdad. This is The Employees by Olga Ravn, and this is a sci-fi workplace book. We are on a ship that has left Earth at some point in the long distant past, and it's staffed by a crew of partly humans, partly not humans. The book is told in a really interesting way. It's all told through sort of updates, almost like diary logs, statements, that's what they're called, about what has happened, what's happening in the ship. I think that it is this amazing mix of like sci-fi, capitalism, workplace drama, human connection, playfulness as well as in the style, and it's just fabulous. I think this is such a brilliant little book. I'm so glad I read this one this year. Another one that I read very early on was Pew by Catherine Lacey. I think this might be my first book of the year last year, and this looks at a young person who turns up one day in the pew of a church, and the community that's very close-knit takes them in and sees themselves as kind of looking after this person in God's name, etc. But they lose interest in their well-being the least questions and the least conforming that Pew is to that community. It's brilliant. Next one is another one that gets high inventiveness points. That's When We Cease to Understand the World. That is by Benjamín Labatut. This book is a very odd new genre bending thing. It's fiction which very much feels as though it is not fiction. It's fictionalized non-fiction in a sense, following a number of famous physicists and sort of imagining in the gaps of their real history. So real physicists, real people, but not necessarily fully true stories. I just think it was fascinating, beautifully written, and even if you're not like a sciencey person, it really doesn't matter. I just think it's so clever, and I kind of want more of this but for different things, but I don't feel like that's probably the direction they'll go in. But yes, I loved it. It was a real flash of novelty, I think. in the style, in what it was trying to achieve. I really enjoyed it. The next one is Patricia Lockwood. No one is talking about this. This definitely divided readers this year, I think. I fell in the camp of loving it. The first half, I have to say, I enjoyed more than the second half, because the first half is just Twitter. It's like a book that feels as though you're scrolling through Twitter. It's definitely a book for people that are very online. It's a book that would make near no sense, I would say, if you aren't online enough to understand maybe some of the references in the first half. So we kind of follow this woman who is eaten up by the internet and see how she deals with her life when she's spat back out into the real world. I really, really loved it. I can see why it's divisive, but I think it's brilliant. And next is one I read in December. This is Matrix by Groff. I know that a few people have picked this one up and really enjoyed it. I really loved it. We follow an odd, gangly, strange woman who is a kind of bastard relation to the royal family. She's ostracised partly because of her lack of beauty and also her kind of odd, illegitimate connection to the family, to go and be a prioress of an abbey. This is so full of like sapphic desire and feminism and strength and grit. It feels really gritty, that I just absolutely adored it. I was quite surprised reading it, because it reads so differently from the other Groff pieces I've read in terms of it's historical fiction, the setting is fairly strong, and we aren't examining relationships as much as we are one character's development, but I absolutely love this one. Next is one I was sent for review and adored. This is The Fell by Sarah Moss. This is exactly the kind of book I wanted to reference COVID, but not be just about COVID in terms of fiction. We are following a woman who has been required to self-isolate at home, who is not someone that deals particularly well with being inside, and this kind of forced need to be inside means that she just can't take it, and she decides to go out for a walk. She doesn't tell anyone where she's going, because obviously she's not supposed to be going out, and something happens. Now what? So something happens to her on this walk. Now what? No one knows where she is. So that is The Fell. I absolutely ate this one up, and it meant I enjoyed it so much. It meant I read all of Sarah Moss's back catalogue in 2021 as well. I've spoken about this one fairly recently, but this is Bewilderment by Richard Powers. This one is well worth a read. I think if you enjoyed the overstory, you'll really like Bewilderment. We follow a father and his young son who has some difficulties. I read it as autism, but you might not necessarily read it as autism. And he struggles with some sort of emotional control, he struggles with sensory things, he struggles with being very literal, and he gets into trouble at school, and his father tries to reconnect to him through nature and through memories of his mother. This is a book about climate change and grief, and it's more knotty than maybe I'm making it. There's an awful lot in here that has clever sci-fi planetary implications, but I just think it's gorgeous nature writing and gorgeous emotional character work, and I think I'm really glad I enjoyed this Richard Powers, because I've read 2 of his other books and didn't enjoy them, and wanted something to bring me back, and this definitely brought me back. Another 5-star book. And then the last fiction that I have not gotten out of my head at all year is The Need. This is probably my book of the year, in that I read it a long time ago, and like my best fiction book of the year certainly, and I can remember every detail of this flipping book. I don't want to spoil it by going into too much detail, but we follow a woman who is an archaeologist, and she's undertaking a dig, and she finds something odd in the dig. She finds something odd in the hole. The book is thematically looking at motherhood, erasure of identity. It's looking at weaponized incompetence of husbands. It's looking at the way that we view ourselves, the way that we objectify ourselves, boundaries. It's just brilliant, and it's terrifying. So this is a really, really scary book. I've gifted this to 3 people this year because I can't get it out of my head. I just absolutely adored it. If you want literary sort of creepiness, can't go higher than recommending The Need. So on to non-fiction. The first one I have is Sanatorium by Abi Palmer. This is a book that's looking at pain, chronic illness. The sort of narrator, the author of this book, is talking about how she sought sort of essentially the water cure. She went to a thermal spa, I think, in Budapest, and had this experience of trying this quite like out there and quite historical way of lessening her pain, and found it helped somewhat, and tried to bring that experience home with just a bathtub that she keeps in her flat. The author, I think, is fairly interesting in terms of what they normally make. So they do mixed media art. So for example, an interactive gambling arcade parodying the wellness industry, and a multi-sensory poetry game. And you can tell in reading this that the author is quite comfortable with mixing genre or mixing approach. It's written in this kind of mix between memoir and poetry, almost, in very short, easy to gobble down pieces. And she also echoes theme a lot through, which feels quite poetic in my head. I really enjoyed this one. I'd happily read it again, and I don't often reread non-fiction, so that's an interesting one. Then we have Spillover by David Quammen. This is one for people that are curious about COVID or have found a newfound interest in infectious disease, having lived through COVID. Spillover looks at the way in which diseases become zoonotic and spread over to human populations. It reads almost like a thriller, and we follow a number of different illnesses and the scientists who map them out. It goes close to, but not quite alongside, predicting COVID in the original text, and the author speaks a little bit about what we might anticipate next for global health in terms of pandemic illness due to things like climate change and habitat destruction. This is probably the best book this year I've read that helped me understand COVID better. So if that's something you want to do, I would really push you towards this one. Then I have Inferno by Catherine Cho. I think lots of people have enjoyed this year, and it makes me really happy because I also wouldn't have heard about it this year if it wasn't for one of you guys here who mentioned the Gillette Prize, and I feel like it's been one that's spread like around the internet in quite a satisfying way, rather than being one that I've necessarily seen pushed like publishing wise, if that makes sense. This is a book about a woman who suffers from postpartum psychosis after she's had her first baby, and we follow her story sort of in the order it happened, with her awareness of what had happened. So we start with her being poorly and in the psychiatric hospital that she's admitted to, not understanding why she's there, who she is, what's happening, when she might leave, and we follow her through as that becomes clearer to her, as reality becomes clearer. And I think it was such a gorgeous way of telling it. It has a very soft spot in my heart because it feels an awful lot like my very first admission when I was most poorly, when I was 18. And I think she does a absolutely stellar job of bringing the reader into the psychiatric unit and telling you exactly what it feels like to be in there. I just think it's brilliant. I don't think it's overblown or dramatised. I think it's just as it is, and that just felt very precious to me. So Inferno is one I'm definitely going to remember and keep in my heart for the years to come. Then I have Disability Visibility. This kick-started more of my reading around ill health, particularly chronic illness. I have a kind of intellectual curiosity around medicine as it is, but I think I hadn't really known much about chronic illness. Probably because my energy has been focused on like chronic mental illness, so that's kind of where my interest has been before. But this book partly kind of brought me into that space of like disability justice for the first time, which I think is brilliant, and I think it's had a really wide appeal, so I hope it's done the same for lots of other people. And it also kind of lit a little bit of fire about learning about more chronic illnesses, so I did really like this one an awful lot. I think it's very approachable if it's not a topic that you're familiar with, or all feels like there's quite a lot going on in that space. I think these essays are a really good place to get started. There's an awful lot of health stuff here, like non-fiction, but moving away from it briefly, we have Having and Being Had by Eula Biss. This book is my like recommendation to you if you're someone that is like, capitalism is a scam, or why is there so much stuff, why does my head feel so full, why don't I feel happy with my life. I have read 3 of Eula Biss's books this year, and I think this one is my favourite. It is looking at our desire to attain through her eyes, and she is a fairly wealthy white woman, and she has an awful lot and it still isn't enough, and it's just this, it's so relatable and so crippling, the way that she describes the relationship she has with things, how things control the way that she lives her life, and I just think more people need to read this one. I haven't seen enough people reading this one. The next one is one that lots of you had said you've enjoyed this year. When I asked in my last video, is there anything this year you've read that if I haven't got around to, you think I should? Crying in H Mark came up a fair few times. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous memoir about loss, essentially, about loss of your mother and your relationship with your mother, about heritage, race, connection, identity, knowing yourself. It also, as the title describes, tells a lot of that through food, through sensory experiences. And I've not lost anyone close to me, but I feel like if I could bear it, this would be a good book to reread if I had. I think it is very vulnerable and very, I want to say sharp-edged. It almost feels a bit like if you were grieving, it's that feeling of if you've broken glass on the floor and you almost can't go near it to clean it up because you're so frightened you might stand on a piece. But I do think it's just gorgeous and clear and well worth a read. But I would say, as it is fairly kind of raw, maybe if you're in that moment and you're in that grief and it's really recent, it might not be the book, but I do think it's brilliant. Back to health, we have Golem Girl by River. This is my favourite book cover of the year, certainly of the books that we're talking about today. And this follows River's life as she was diagnosed with spina bifida following her birth, and tells the story of how her life has been affected by kind of the medical complex and the efforts to change her, the ways in which society around her have changed to some lesser or greater extent. And as the book goes on, her linking into kind of like crip justice and disability awareness and justice and like active caring for people within the disability community. This was one that I read fairly early on in terms of the quantity of books on disability I've read this year. But I just think it's gorgeous. It's also really lovely the way the book is put together. So she talks to lots of other people with disabilities, and she's an artist, so we get these drawings throughout the book that kind of portray the experience of herself or of the people that she loves, and how they are living with their disabilities and what that experience feels like for them. I think it's really interesting. The cover is also one of her pieces of art, and I just think it's fascinating. You can see the X-ray kind of blocking out her face. It's brilliant. I loved this book so much. If you haven't read this one, again, this is one of my like absolute top picks for 2021. I would just push it in everyone's hands. The next one I have is Unwell Women by Eleanor Cleghorn. This is a book looking at the experience of women in healthcare, the ways in which female experience is minimised, dismissed, or just simply not considered by the medical establishment, and the manners in which sexism can prevent sort of diagnosis and treatment, and has for the history of medicine. This is feminism and medicine all wrapped up in a bundle. If you're interested in any of those things, I think you'd enjoy this one. It also is a bigger book, but it reads very quickly. It's very compelling. I read this and Pain and Prejudice, and I do think this one took the cake by a little bit. And then the last one I have is one I've read very recently, so I recommend this wholeheartedly, but with the caveat that it hasn't had the same time necessarily as some of these to percolate. So this is why it's coming in finally, which is Ill Feelings by Alice Hattrick. I finished this 2 days ago, so it's always a bit hard fitting books that are just so recent in your head on your best books list. But I do think this is brilliant and I want to talk about it, so it's staying on. This is the story of a woman and her mother who both have chronic fatigue syndrome, and they suffer from very similar symptoms. They have these waves of symptoms, these waves of periods of relative wellness, and it is this window into the life of someone with chronic fatigue, and the kind of thoughts that happen within her head and the anger that's there. There's a lot of anger that she speaks about within this book, about her losses and the grief there is associated with elements of her life. There's also a real sense in the book itself, in the writing of the book, that she's kind of imploring people to care more, do more, and learn more about the condition. Chronic fatigue syndrome is something I know very little about, and I really loved reading this first person account. So those are all of the books that I really want to recommend to you from 2021. They're my favourite picks of last year. I feel like I had such a good non-fiction reading year. I think statistically I ended up with about 46% non-fiction and 54% fiction, and I love that. We're doing that again in 2022. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, you've had some good recommendations from this video, and I'll see you all again soon in my next video. I'm thinking about doing another vlog at some point soon, so I'll see you all then. Bye!